So last June I was in Hillsboro, and I think it's fair to say a lot has happened since then. And I think most notably this. So I think it's fair to say that probably none of us have ever seen anything like this before. To use a polite word, I think it's effed up a lot of things for everybody. We've got personal shit to deal with, professional shit to deal with. I know it can be very overwhelming. As you know, or many of you know, I run a business that mainly involves a guy from New York City wandering around state to state, helping groups of 100+ people to solve their problems. So you can imagine how popular that is right now. To put on top of that, the renter of my apartment in Brooklyn works for an event space in New York City. You can imagine how popular that is. He's asked for a 20% rent reduction to match his 20% reduction of salary. My mother works in a hospital in the Netherlands and has emphysema, so I'm acting as guidance counselor there. And I'm also homeschooling my 2 kids. So you can imagine how much their language has improved over the last 3 or 4 months. And all this while I'm still running Lateral Labs. And it's a lot to handle, but I actually know that I'm one of the lucky ones. So I'm not going to be complaining about it. And I know a lot of you guys are going through the same things too. Take a look at these questions, and I'm sure some of them are probably questions that you're asking yourselves. I'm sure you think about many of them many times a day. But as much as we want to question ourselves, I think the most important thing is how can we respond? And in particular, how can we combat these constraints that COVID-19 has placed on our businesses? And I think the answer is creativity. Now, I do these talks a lot. I go all over the world, and I will say that I come across my fair share of people that think creativity is a luxury. It's something that, they can think about when times are good. I think right now, creativity is a necessity. And today, we're going to be really focusing heavily on how we can use that creativity within ourselves, within our communities, to combat these constraints and help our businesses thrive. And the way we're going to do that is really to focus on what I would call the 4 M's. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to learn how to ditch that victim mindset. Some of you will be in it, some of you won't. Some of you won't know what that is. We're going to find answers to all those things today. But the key to ditching a victim mindset is to start seeing these constraints as opportunities to do things differently and to do things better. Second, I'm going to talk you through some specific methodologies we can apply to transform what we often perceive as negative constraints into positive outcomes. Third, we're going to look at how we can create confidence and motivate yourself, your staff, your customers, and your partners. And then last but not least, we'll all look at how we can take action and mobilize momentum, move forward much stronger than before. So let's start with this mindset. It's really important that we ditch a victim mindset. The key to doing this is to not dial down your ambitions to satisfy your constraint. So what happens when we're normally faced with a constraint? How do most people respond? They respond by thinking something like this. If you do 50% less, you'll be 50% worse, at least. So how do I respond to 50% lower capacity in my restaurant? I serve half as many people. The problem is that by scaling down your ambition, you're playing the victim. And nobody wants 20% less cake on their plate or 20% shorter shoelaces. If we take what our customers have been happy with and we reduce it by 20 or 50%, we're going to piss them off. But that's exactly what most people do. They play the victim, and in return, they make their customers the victim. So we need to make sure that we ditch this victim mindset fast. So how do we do it? Well, we do it by getting behind what's in this beautiful mathematical number line. So anybody who's been helping their kids with their math like me during lockdown is probably sick to death of number lines. But I think a graphical representation really helps here. So let us start at the top by thinking about the situation pre-COVID. You probably had a nice balance between constraint and ambition. You seemed to be in equilibrium. You knew what worked, what didn't work, you were humming along nicely. But now let's look at what happens when COVID hits. All of a sudden, your constraints ramp up. You move further to the left on your number line. The most common response, as I've said, is to play the victim. And how does a victim respond? It keeps doing things exactly the same way. After all, you're so helpless as a victim, why even try to do things differently? But with one exception. You dial down your ambition pro rata in line with your constraint. This is that 50% less, 50% worse scenario. And it's really tempting. You can use your best practices manual and all your usual processes. You can execute efficiently, but 50% worse is a recipe for disaster. And you're going to crash and burn fast. You can even think of these diagrams as like seesaws, right? It's like, well, if you move negatively to the left, then you're going to tip off, crash and burn pretty quick. The second most common response is to play the role of the neutralizer. These people are a stubborn bunch. They take the constraints they're given, but they bust their asses to maintain the same level of ambition. This is what I would call the work harder, not smarter group. These people will also stay stuck on the same old path because they need all that efficiency to work harder. Certainly better than playing the victim, but it isn't sustainable. You won't crash and burn as fast as a victim, but the weight of the constraint will still tip the scale against you over time. So let's look at the last group. The last groups are the transformers. This group takes the constraint, even ramping it up in some instances, and ramps up their ambition simultaneously. The difference between their constraints and their ambition becomes so stretched, the tension is so great, that they have absolutely no option than to do things differently, to think creatively. Take Netafim as an example. This is a company that was created in the Negev Desert in Israel. Not a place where you would think would be a natural home for one of the world's leading irrigation companies. But they took their constraint, which, as you can probably imagine, was no water, and they looked at ways in how they could actually increase their yields. So they really ramped up that ambition. And they satisfied that constraint, they realized their ambition, and have built one of the biggest drip irrigation companies in the world. So if they can increase yields in a desert, I think we can combat our constraints to realize our ambitions in Hillsboro. Now, the interesting thing here is, most people look at, victims or neutralizers and transformers, and they think, oh, I remember that miserable guy. I know him. He's always the victim. And there's a little truth in that, but science and the data suggests that these aren't actually really people types. They're more like phases. So we can all be victims sometimes. We can all be neutralizers sometimes. We can all be transformers sometimes. The great thing with that is it's a skill you can actually learn. So there's no reason why we can't move between our victim phases, our neutralizer phases, and our transformer phases. And the way we will do that is by transforming our constraints into survival strategies and opportunities for growth. So what are those strategies? What are those methods that we can use to combat our constraints? Well, first, let's look at what a constraint is. The formal definition of a constraint is a limitation imposed by outside circumstances or ourselves that materially affects our ability to do something. Now, clearly, when looking at COVID, when we're mostly talking about limitations imposed by outside circumstances. But that doesn't stop us from placing constraints on ourselves. Remember, I said earlier, transformers often choose to ramp up their constraints. But as a starting point, I think we have enough outside constraints to work with right now. So that's where we'll be focused for our time today. So what are these constraints? There are many of them. I'm sure you're seeing them by the hatful every day. But they can be bucketed into four main types. The first type is what we call a foundation constraint. A foundation constraint is where you are missing a key element that appears fundamental for the success of your business. An example of this would be Zappos, who started a shoe company without a bricks and mortar shop that enabled people to try shoes before they buy. We all know how they managed to scale up their ambition in spite or even because of their constraint. A resource constraint is where you don't have the budget or staff you need to operate effectively. An example of this would be Southwest Airlines, who got into some financial difficulties a couple of decades ago, where they used to run 4 routes with 4 planes. They had to sell one of their planes to survive. So they had a constraint, a resource constraint, 3 planes instead of 4, but they maintained their ambition. They still managed to serve those 4 routes, and the way they did that was to get creative. They knew that if they could get their plane turnaround times to 10 minutes, then they could still service those 4 routes with only 3 planes. Needless to say, as they grew and expanded, they kept all those best practices, and that's one of the main reasons why Southwest Airlines have been successful from there on in. The third type of constraint is a time constraint, when you don't have enough time to do things the normal way. My company, Lateral Labs, was founded on a self-imposed time constraint. By committing to solve problems in 2 hours or less, there was no way we could ever operate like McKinsey or other conventional management consultancies, and nor would we ever want to. Finally, method constraints. This means we are limited by having to do something in a certain way. Becoming contactless during COVID would be a great example of a method constraint. You could even look at the Zappos example and say that is a method constraint, as people were unable to try before they buy. Many of these constraints overlap. You often have more than one, and you certainly have many of them during COVID. So let's look at the other side of the equation, ambition. Again, 4 types. You might be motivated by growth, be that more revenue or more customers. You might be motivated by impact, improving more lives. You may be motivated by quality, just being the best. And finally, you may be motivated by creating the most memorable experience. No matter what your ambition, the key to ditching the victim mindset and being a transformer is ramping up these types of ambition in the presence of those constraints. People often ask, well, how far do we ramp up our ambition? Well, it needs to be a specific high bar, a target that represents your highest hope of something that you haven't been able to achieve before. That's how we force ourselves to get creative during COVID. So if you remember from an early slide, I presented a bunch of different questions that you may be asking yourselves during this time, a series of questions. So how do we frame our challenge to make sure that we can make that leap from victim to transformer? Well, the secret is maximizing that tension between constraint and ambition. And the best questions you can start with have both. So let's look at the question on the left of the slide. How can our restaurant survive at 50% capacity? Well, you're already sounding like a bit of a victim by the way you phrased that question in the first place. Survival sounds like a victim, right? We do have a constraint, but survival isn't an ambition, so let's look at it another way. How can we upgrade our dining experience by serving twice as fast? This is a direct response to 50% capacity, right? If we have 50% capacity, but we can serve twice as fast, we end up being back where we started. But the constraint question on the right seemed contradictory, right? Upgrading dining experience by serving twice as fast. I think if anybody wanted a brilliant dining experience, they wouldn't be heading to McDonald's, which is associated with fast food. But contradictory constraints or contradictory problem statements are the best way to frame our challenges. Why? Because they guarantee we'll be forced to think differently. We really stretch that creative tension. And that's the secret when we're searching for creative responses to COVID. So once we've posed the appropriate question and we've phrased it the right way to make sure that it includes our constraint and our ambition, the next thing we need to do is open our minds to potential solutions. There's no point in phrasing a question really well if you're not interested in trying to find the answer. You can only move from a victim to a transformer if you believe a solution is possible. Sure, it helps if you've done something like this before, or you're aware of others who have made this breakthrough, and I'd encourage you to spend time in thinking along those lines to really get you in the right frame of mind. But there's also a way we can do this quickly. And that's just with a simple change of vocabulary. We can open our minds to new solutions by simply moving from a can't mindset to a can if. So how do we use that can if mentality? There are 8 ways in which you can follow potential paths using a can if mindset to solve your challenge. There's probably many more, but I found that most of them fit nicely into these 8 buckets. So let's start at the top. We can solve our problem if we use other people too. So here we're using the skills and expertise of other people to alleviate our constraint and solve our challenge. As an example, Airbnb pays local photography enthusiasts to take pictures of homes for rent on their platform, rather than paying internal staff to fly all over the world. They didn't respond to that constraint of costly travel by saying, okay, it's going to be really expensive to fly our photographers around the world, so let's have 50 properties on our platform. They responded to that constraint by finding people who could serve as an additional resource. Next, we can solve our problem if we remove X to allow Y. This really necessitates a shift in priorities. Can you remove a step in the process to allow yourself to do something else? Hugh, a chain of salons in New Zealand, removed drying services to cut costs in their hair salons. They wanted to be a cost leader, price leader company. So what did they do? They removed drying. They forced their customers to dry their own hair. That's something that could be applied right now. Customers are concerned about spreading the virus in salons with hair dryers. They're also cash constrained. You can kill two birds with one stone by charging lower prices and having customers dry their own hair. In this method, you really have to question what is essential. If you're a hotel with increased cleaning costs, get rid of the slippers and robes. Do people really want to be touching them right now anyway? It's a simple case of removing X to allow Y. Next, we can solve our problem if we access the knowledge of. An example here is Timbuktu. I don't know if you guys are aware of that brand, but they make backpacks predominantly. So unlike their competitors, they reduce the need for a large R&D department by keeping a close eye on alterations customers made to their backpacks themselves. I would argue that this group in itself on this call today has a tremendous amount of knowledge that could help combat the constraints of other members. In fact, I think you could form what I would call a COVID collective that allows you to trade goods and services. Takes cash, which is constrained right now, completely out of the equation, but I'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. Next, we can solve our problem if we introduce a new product or service dimension into the process. If you're a restaurant that's being forced to run at 50% capacity due to social distancing requirements, introduce a catering company. Not just any catering company, but one that's a little bit more proactive. And again, I'll speak more on that in a minute. Next, can we solve our problem if we substitute X for Y? Here we directly substitute one apparently essential part of the product process or experience for another. This is a little different from what I talked about earlier when I talked about removing X to allow Y, because that was really just freeing up budget and capital to allow you to do something else. This is more of a direct substitution. Probably the most prominent example of this right now is restaurants exchanging bricks and mortar for food carts. But why aren't there more closed carts? You can travel across the city, bringing your products to locals when they're scared to travel. And even after lockdown, if you want to return to your conventional shop, you can still use the cart to raise brand awareness in other locations. Next, we can fund it by, often the problem isn't finding a solution, it's funding a solution. Crowdfunding is probably the most famous response to this constraint right now, getting customers to pay in advance to fund product and service development. Sales of gift cards is another alternative, but I would argue that these are fairly predictable paths, and I'm not really telling you anything new there. But what if you could come up with more creative funding channels? What about responding to your constraint by starting a new business line that solves that problem for both for yourself and others suffering the same fate in your industry? If you're struggling to convince visitors to stay in your hotel, start an independent clean order outfit and provide the service to your competitors too. That will help you generate the funds to alleviate your other constraints. Next, we mix together. Here's where you form creative new partnerships to put together new combinations that were not considered before the constraint. A restaurant partnering with a treasure hunt company. A hotel partnering with a biomedical diagnostics company. You collect, they detect. If these sound far-fetched, great. That's exactly what we're looking for. And then last but not least, we can solve our problem if we resource it by accessing assets owned by others. Can you piggyback off distribution channels owned by other organizations? An example of that is how the NGO Cola Life distributed their dehydration salts across Africa by installing them in the gaps in Coca-Cola bottle crates. This is really important. I would argue it's probably the most important of all these 8, because the key right now to keeping or scaling up our ambition in the presence of constraints is broadening our definition of resources. So let's just take a look at that definition right now. There are a couple of things that stand out to me when I think about this definition of resource. First, other assets. This is key. We don't have much money or materials right now. Some of our staff are choosing to pick up stimulus payments rather than work. So that's a scarce resource for many too. So many of us are just left with other assets. Well, what are other assets, you may ask? Well, anything other than money, materials, and staff, obviously. But other assets are really what force us to get creative. The second thing that stands out for me, perhaps most importantly, is the phrase drawn on. Other assets that can be drawn on by a person or organization. Notice it doesn't say owned by or even controlled by. In order to combat constraints during this pandemic, I would argue it's essential to take a much broader view, a much broader definition of resources. It's all about access, not ownership. In a way, it's actually very similar to the sharing economy. Think of assets that your business needs and look for people with spare capacity and abundance in those assets. Saw a really cool example this week. Walmart are opening their parking lots for drive-in theaters. Why couldn't your restaurant create a menu from Walmart products and serve food during the movie in those parking lots? I'm starting to think very differently about my resources. So what's the best way to realize your ambitions by combating your constraints right now? Well, I do think it's all about broadening that definition of resources and gaining access. I actually think the best way to deal with constraints right now is bartering. I think in many ways this pandemic has taken the world back 2,000 years, and maybe there's some solutions from 2,000 years ago. When there's no cash available, why don't we barter? Why don't we trade our resources? There would be three ways in order to build a collective. First, everybody would identify potential resources they need. Second, they would build an inventory of their own assets. And third, we would identify how these assets can add value for others. Right now, it's all about the give and get. And this system could be set up in one day on Wix or a similar platform. And I personally think it could be a game changer right now. And as I walk you through some examples, you'll see some opportunities of where these types of partnerships could be really profitable. So let's put some of these principles into action. Let's look at some of these questions that we've been asking ourselves, and let's see what we can come up with to combat our constraints and realizing our ambitions if we adopt a can-if mindset. So let's start with, how can our restaurant survive at 50% capacity? Well, we can if we mix together spare capacity across the town. Maybe we use spare capacity of that closed boutique next door. Here we're broadening our resource base. We're considering resources that we have access to rather than assets we own. It would be easy to partner with a closed boutique down the road. Normally shop from 6 p.m., exactly when you need more capacity for your dinner service. So maybe you're not at 50% capacity, maybe you're back at 100% already if you simply take a broader view on what resources really need. This could also open up an entirely new catering business for you, where you offer tailored dinner services in spaces across the city. This isn't your typical boring creative company that acts reactively, sitting by the phone waiting for a client to call. Now you're an event planner too, developing custom catering experiences for businesses across the city. It could be an Audrey Hepburn themed dinner to showcase a new line at that local clothes boutique, or a meal from 1930 to celebrate the launch of a new antiques exhibit. Third, we can reverse the reduction in capacity by serving twice as fast. More on that in a second. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Justin, this is great, but that question is really just all about constraint. It doesn't say anything about ambition. And I would say, thanks for listening. But even a poorly constrained question can lead to good ideas. But let's see what happens when we can work on that wording. See how a simple choice of words can create a new way of looking at the challenge and help free us from victim mindset. So in this new question, which again appears contradictory, we have a constraint and we have ambition. Our constraint is serving twice as fast, and our ambition is upgrading our dining experience. So how can we serve people twice as fast? We replace menus with online ordering. This can also help the dining experience too, as if anybody's like me and that horrible procrastinator in a restaurant, we know that that is the biggest unknown in customer wait times. And we can't have customers waiting around anywhere right now. Restaurant owners know how long it takes to prepare the meal, but we don't know how long it's going to take for our customer to order it. The will they have a dessert or won't they have a dessert phenomenon creates a similar issue that can also be dealt with via online meal ordering. If you think that sounds expensive to develop, well, we're not thinking broadly enough about our resources. We can develop that system if we can access the knowledge of developers, maybe in exchange for a free happy hour hackathon. Bring in local software development experts, feed them lunch or dinner, and have them develop your ordering system real time. How else can we make things twice as fast? Maybe we substitute those time-sucking soufflés for speedy sundaes. You might want to, in a normal business operating condition, serve those soufflés. They may be your speciality, but this isn't a business as usual scenario. So if we want to deal with 50% capacity due to social distancing, if we want to serve people twice as fast, we can if we introduce faster to prepare items. Or maybe we do away with in-house desserts altogether. Maybe we substitute sit-down desserts for ice cream cone treasure hunts, where people take their ice creams, engage in our treasure hunt, maybe earn that $100 gift certificate, and who knows, maybe some of those stops can be at local businesses in our community that would also like to see an increase in traffic. So here we can see what we can achieve if we move from a can't to a can-if mindset. Let's look at some other challenges faced by businesses in Hillsboro. How can our cleaners make more money while cleaning fewer hotel rooms? Again, there's a constraint and an ambition there. Our cleaners can make more money if we fund it through a dedicated hotel cleaning company that provides part-time assistance to hotels across the city that are also struggling to keep cleaners fully employed with fewer visitors. You might be thinking, that's great, Justin, but you're just putting the other cleaners out of work. That's a fair point. So let's take it one step further. We can, if we mix together by partnering with a disease diagnostic service to form an independent coronavirus safety audit company for hotels. Your cleaner collects, the diagnostic company detects. And furthermore, we build customer confidence by signaling safety in hotels. While we're here, another idea for hotels in Hillsboro. contactless concierge, a single virtual concierge service that serves all hotels in Hillsboro. Let's look at another problem. How can we sell more clothes to cash-constrained customers with nowhere to go? First, let's look at that word sell. What are the alternatives? Rent, for one. What about give? Let's start with rent first. Many of you will know this is already done for high price, high fashion items through services like Rent the Runway, where people are renting rather than buying clothes. I would argue that given current consumer cash constraints, the bar has been lowered across the board for what people would rent versus what they would buy. So maybe your clothes are now squarely in the crosshairs for items that would be rentable. Let's turn to give. I'm sure many people have kind of gone through a similar thought process that I have in the last 3 or 4 months, which is it's not really the right time for me to be spending money on myself, but it is the right time to be giving to others. So maybe if we focus on giving clothes rather than selling clothes, there's an opportunity to combat our constraint there. You might be thinking, well, that's great, Justin. I'm struggling enough as it is, and now you're encouraging me to give clothes away. I didn't say that you had to give clothes away. Maybe there's somebody else who could give clothes away for you. So maybe we could, as a clothes company, hold a virtual Strictly Come Dancing style fashion makeover show. We get a group of friends together, they pay $10 each, and the contestant voted to have the best makeover gets to keep their outfit. So you'd effectively be selling one item of clothing per event. To me, it certainly beats dragging that unfortunate friend around town, asking them for feedback when you come out of the changing room. Here you can almost crowdsource feedback, get multiple people on at the same time, and make better decisions on what you should be wearing. You could partner with other organizations too. You could add a partner from a beauty salon who gives makeup tips or hair tips. In addition to changing clothes, you can change your look. You can also approach local bars for fashion-themed cocktails. There's many things you could do here. You could have working it from home sessions rather than working from home sessions, promoting it with the hashtag No More Sweats. So really, the key here for me, is looking at potential partnerships and broadening out those access to resources. Let's look at another problem. How can we sell antiques that people can't touch? Is that word sell again? Can we use the rental model here? Sure we can. Now, rather than rent the runway, we have rent the relic. Again, we're increasing customer confidence by reducing the risk associated with an upfront cost and giving them the chance to try it on, or in this instance, displaying that antique in their homes to see if it fits. People are stuck at home, they'd love to switch things up. Maybe this is an opportunity to sell more antiques. And last but not least, how can our gallery increase engagement without any visitors? Again, seems contradictory, right? Not if you define visitors as virtual visitors. How can we increase engagement? Well, we can if we use people with time on their hands to submit art for our virtual art show, Lockdown Love, where they share artwork that depicts positive emotions and experiences they've had during lockdown. You can get the public to vote on what they like best. You as the art gallery owner will be getting free feedback on the promises of new exhibitors to showcase when things return to normal. And you don't even need to focus on good art. There's no reason why you couldn't stage a nailed it art equivalent where people share their disastrous drawings. People certainly need a laugh right now, and by lightening the mood, you may be able to tap into new groups of future visitors who have historically been turned off by their perceptions of snobby art galleries. I just want to leave you one last thought in this section that I think is important. And this has probably been self-evident based on the examples that I provided a minute ago. But the potential for partnerships is limited. That's how you're going to broaden your resource base. And I would argue that's why a COVID collective and a broader sense of community is so important right now. Section 3, mastering motivation. So we've ditched the victim mindset. We found ways to transform our constraints into opportunities. But all that work will be wasted if the motivation is missing. So who do we need to motivate? Who do we need to build confidence with and in? I don't just mean personal motivation here. I mean you, your staff, your customers, and your potential partners. So first, let's deal with yourself. Do you really believe you can do this? Is it important enough for you to push through the obstacles you'll face? Is it emotional for you? As small business owners, the answers to these questions is going to be yes, more often than no. So there's some great news right there, a reason to be positive. However, you're only human, and right now, you're going to have negative thoughts too. But here's some more good news. Scientific studies have proven that the best motivational mindset is one with both positive and negative thoughts. Positive and negative motivation. So that fear and anxiety that you're quite rightfully feeling, don't fight it, use it. Don't be frozen by fear, use it as the motivation to keep moving forward. And if you're still struggling to motivate yourself, one thing that I find works for me is going back to that big, badass original idea you had in the first place. When I need motivation, I think about how awesome the world would be if we could all solve our problems in 2 hours or less. It also takes me back to my loathing of traditional consulting firms with their months-long engagements and client dependency. Don't hesitate to cast your mind back to the beginning. The majority of us were most motivated when we started our businesses. That's why we were crazy enough to start with them in the first place. So use that power of purpose to master your own motivation. Next, let's look at staff. We all know that the first thing we can do to motivate staff is to motivate ourselves, but hopefully we've taken care of that. You can't expect your staff to believe in your business more than you. Once we've sorted ourselves out, the best thing you can do to motivate your staff is to make them owners. And that doesn't mean giving away your business or your baby. There's much more to ownership than that. You should know. The first step in motivating staff is to be transparent with them. They should know what owners are. No more smokes and mirrors, no more bullshit. The great thing is when they know what you know, you're ready for the next step. And that's asking for help. With transparency, this call for help has way more context. It increases the probability that they'll respond positively for your call for help and that additional responsibility. Now you're ready for that last step. Creating incentive structures with sufficient upside to make those stimulus checks look pitiful. Profit splits are a really great way to mimic ownership without giving up equity or your business. But this is also where the we fund it by side businesses that we've talked about can really come in handy. You don't have to give away your core business, but you can split equity in these new businesses to make your staff owners in the purest sense possible. Next group, customers. The best way to motivate customers is to meet them where they're at. If you've asked the right questions and you've developed your solutions taking customer constraints into consideration, like renting rather than buying, you're already winning the battle. Motivating customers, creating the confidence they need to transact with you can't be marketing and branding bullshit. People are too scared right now to be swayed by a marketing gimmick. To create confidence, you need to fundamentally change your model to meet those customers where they're at. If they're scared to make big purchases, rent to them, don't sell to them. If they're scared to venture out of their homes, let them try before they buy. The secret to creating confidence right now is customer comfort. And your model needs to be laser focused on reducing any obstacles to customer comfort embedded in your business. Finally, partners. Well, why is motivating partners so important right now? Well, as I said earlier, with all the COVID constraints, we need to broaden our resource base. And partners are absolutely the key. Our creativity will hopefully lead us to explore beyond conventional partnerships. So work needs to be done to convince these newcomers to trade with us. So how do we motivate them to trade resources with us? The best way to motivate partners is to create shared agendas. Perhaps your initial strategy to create that cleaning company to employ your cleaners full time did not go down well with potential hotel partners because you would be making their cleaners redundant. But perhaps you could employ cleaners from other hotels as part of your independent COVID audit team. They can add to your army of COVID collectors and increase your diagnostics capacity. That would sit much better with your hotel partners as you're providing work for their cleaners and sending a clear signal that the hotel industry was working to prioritize guest safety. Shared agendas are the key to motivating partners. So we've ditched the victim mindset. We've embraced our constraints and found new ways to realize our ambitions. We've motivated ourselves and those around us. Now it's time to take action. But it's a strange time to take action, as you may have been in business for 30 years, but you've been in this business since March. So what does that mean? It means that everything is a startup. Don't believe me? Let's look at what a startup really is. A startup is a human institution designed to create new products and services under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Sounds like today, right? The bad news is that as a startup, we can't rely on the old way of doing things. But we know that's actually really good news, right? The even better news is that there's no shortage of startup methodologies we can apply to our new world. And the most relevant right now is the lean startup methodology. Lean startup methodology is a methodology for developing products and services that aims to shorten development cycles and rapidly discover if one of your new proposed brilliant ideas is viable. Something we totally need during periods of extreme uncertainty like today. The good news is that with so much uncertainty, you're not expected to get it all right. But what you are expected to do is find out what works with the minimum amount of waste. At its core is an accelerated 3-stage build, measure, learn feedback loop, where we build minimum viable products to test key assumptions underpinning our brilliant new ideas, measure the performance of these products and services against target metrics, and 3, validate our learning to inform our decision to either persevere with our brilliant new efforts or pivot to a new alternative. So let's look quickly at these 3 stages in turn. The first thing we need to do when we're building these new ideas is to build a minimum viable product that is just enough to test the fundamental assumptions of our new product or service. Do people want it? Will people use it? How will they react to it? With so much uncertainty right now, the minimum viable product is more important than ever, as things can change quickly And as I mentioned, the last thing we want to do is waste our time or any of our resources. And you'd be surprised how minimal these products could be. Oftentimes, when I work with clients, we start by using a marketing smoke test to assess demand. This tests a fundamental assumption. Do people even want this thing? We use MailChimp to create a landing page that provides a high-level description of the new product or service and a sign up for interested parties. The most interesting thing, the product doesn't even exist yet. Why would I want to build a product when I don't even know demand? We did this for something called Pathway Pilot earlier this year. We simply created a landing page that asked participants in Startup Week Fort Collins to sign up if they wanted a system to automatically curate a kick-ass curriculum for them. And we set an interest threshold. That interest threshold is what we measure against. It helps us define what successfully satisfying our assumption looks like and whether or not we meet it. In the case of Pathway Pilot, it was how many people would sign up for the service. We set a target of 50 people. We got more than 100. You can measure all kinds of things. How many virtual drawings were submitted for your art show? How many people placed their meal orders online? Is Facebook the best channel to identify groups of people to participate in our virtual fashion shows? These things are all different, but you're essentially measuring how customers or potential customers respond to your offering. The final phase in the Lean Startup feedback loop is the validated learning phase. Here you compare your target metrics to your actuals and take any other findings. And in my experience, there are no shortages of surprises. And you look at what you've learned. See if your initial assumptions have been validated and then make the decision. Do you persevere if your assumptions have been validated? Yes. Or do you pivot? Do you change direction? With Pathway Pilot, we had double the amount of people sign up, as I mentioned. So our assumption that this was a product people wanted was validated. We then moved on to the next feedback loop by actually building a product. But to stay true to the process, this wasn't a curriculum curation app available in the App Store with all bells and whistles that you could imagine. It was a simple survey that allows us to develop participant profiles that we could map to a future model. We were testing that even if people signed up, would they actually give us the information we needed to build their curriculum? Could they even be asked to fill out a survey? Another MVP to test an assumption. That's how you need to operate as a startup, and I think that's how you need to operate right now. So let's finish by just running through that process with an example that we've been building upon during the presentation. The idea that we can serve people faster if they place their meal order online before arrival. So we build a basic online ordering website where customers can reserve their meal. It has to be basic. And remember, if we run that happy hour hackathon for developers, it's going to be really cheap to deliver to, something that's really important if we're minimizing waste and building minimal viable products. There are a bunch of things we could measure. We could measure the number of website visitors per order. That could help inform us if the website works. We could measure average order size per customer and compare it to our business as usual metrics. We can measure if people are ordering more or fewer courses, or if they are choosing cheaper items because they're not trying to show off in front of their date at the table. We could also measure what meal duration times look like to see if this is helping us achieve our ultimate goal. Maybe you break these measurement metrics into individual bills, but you get the idea. Finally, you see if your assumptions have been validated, what you have learned. Maybe you learned that people like to order dinner online, but not lunch. Maybe you learned that 95% of people ordered a 3-course meal online, way in excess of what they normally do in the restaurant. Maybe you learned that men still ordered the most expensive item on the menu when making a reservation for 2. All these learnings will help you make that critical decision of whether or not to persevere and pivot. That is how you build businesses in extreme uncertainty to minimize waste and maximize the probability of your success. So there you have it. Ways to respond creatively to COVID by ditching your victim mindset, combating constraints, ramping up your ambition, motivating those around you, and rapidly putting all those incredible ideas into action. Now, I said I have questions, but Deanna says we finish on time. So it's 1:58, but I'm open.
Justin, thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm exhausted. Literally, I'm exhausted, and you're the one that did all the work. So yes, we will take as many questions as we're able to. And if we have to go a little beyond 11, I'm fine with that as well. So I will open it up. If there's any questions, you can just unmute yourself and ask Justin. It was a lot of information. No questions. So they're all stunned is what I think is like just completely blown away. How do we go about doing this? I love the idea of the collective. And I really think that that is something where, you know, the chamber could be sort of facilitating in that process as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've said to you before, Deanna, that most chambers suck, yours doesn't. And you do have that sense of community that you've created in the past. So it will be very authentic if you try and build it now, whereas other chambers are rushing to make themselves relevant. So I actually think you have a real shot at it. And I think it's something very easy to set up. It's really just a question of setting up a portal where people can post what they need and people can post what they will give in return. And as I mentioned, there's a shortage of cash right now. So anything you can do to take cash out of the equation, I think can help people move forward in the best way possible.
Agreed. And I think that, you know, you and I talked before we launched this, that, you know, they're the basic sort of concerns and needs that folks have, which is, you know, rent payments, bringing staff back, those kinds of things. But if you can concentrate more on solutions for those bigger ticket items, so to speak, if you're, you know, if those other needs can be met by, you know, exchanging or partnering, then it just is one less thing for you to have to worry about.
Right. I agree.
No other questions from any of our guests? We have this amazing talent here, folks.
I think people are being a little shy, so why don't we do this? If people have questions, feel free to shoot them to Deanna, and I'll respond to the first 3 that I see. There
you go. This is your opportunity to have, you know, one of the leading startup and creative thinkers tackle your problem head on. So Justin, a pleasure again. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence and your ingenuity and creativity. Definitely, this is a lot of things for us to think about, and a lot of things that it is empowering. If you have some solutions, it really moves you from, you know, a position of, like you said, victim or being absolutely in control of nothing, to grasping and figuring out how you're going to take control of your business again.
Yeah. Well, I'm rooting for all you guys, and yeah, you have a big fan up here in New York, so go get them.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Justin. Take care. The best to your family. Stay healthy.
Yeah, you too. Take care, guys.
Thanks.